such a strong personal connection to this book. And I felt a strong connection to it even before I actually read it. So I came on, as some of the viewers might know, I came on at the copy editing stage of your book. I was asked by University of Alberta Press to copy edit the book in preparation for publication. And the request came in just a few days shy of the first anniversary of my brother's death of pancreatic cancer. And when I read the synopsis of the book, I immediately thought that this was something I really wanted to work on. And I suspect that had the people at UAP known about this anniversary coming up, it's possible that they wouldn't have sent the book to me, thinking that maybe it was a little too close to home. But your book just deals with death in such an intimate, graceful, compassionate, human way. And for me as an editor, it was a wonderful way to read your book, because when I edit, I have to read with a lot of attention. So, you know, I can't read in the mode where I might just be picking something up randomly before bedtime and thinking, oh, I'll read a little bit just before I fall asleep. I have to be there with all my neurons present. And I really hope that that's how readers approach your book generally. The book is so smooth to read. The prose is silken. It has a simplicity to it. And I hope that readers aren't lured by this into thinking that this is a book that they can breeze through, especially the early chapters that kind of put the reader in the perspective of a child's mind. There's a simplicity to the book, but also a profundity that I think really deserves time and a lot of attention as you read it. So it was such an enormous gift for me to be able to work on this book with you, and such a delight to get to know you. It's really, I think, a very important book on a topic that many people have a hard time broaching. So what we're going to do this evening is I hope that you and I will have a chat about some of the topics coming out of the book. And maybe we'll start with having you to read a small selection from the book. There's a story in there about a couple, Doug and Janice, that I think is just such a great example, because to me, it really captures some of the difficulties that many people feel when they're in the presence of someone who is going through a lot of suffering or who is facing death. And that universal feeling of, what could I possibly say to this person? So I wonder if you could start us off with a reading from that story, and then you and I can chat about some of the topics in your book.
Sure, I'd be glad to. Thank you. Thank you again for this opportunity. Thanks to June, thanks to Shelf Life Books. And thanks very much to you, Julie, for agreeing to be the moderator for this. I feel very grateful to University of Alberta Press that they've created a home, so to speak, for me to return back to. I was born in Lethbridge and spent some important parts of my life growing up in southern Alberta, southern Alberta, as far south as you can go. One more step and you'll be in Montana. One more step to the west and you'll be, or I should say 20 more steps to the west, you'll be in Waterton Park. So that's where some of my important growing up happened. So I'm grateful to all of these forces that made this a possibility. And Julie, as you were talking, and we were talking about your experience as copy editor and then really editor, I should say, I hope viewers, if they find, or readers, if readers find the prose to be silky, as Julie said, that's a very nice compliment. It's because I was lucky enough to have 2 editors, if you can imagine, before the manuscript even arrived, before I submitted it to University of Alberta Press. I had already spent months working with an editor, Irene Connolly, who lives in Iowa and is a real master editor. And whenever necessary, she would polish and polish and polish. And whenever necessary, she would get out her big hatchet and tell me, yeah, let's take care of this the easy way, when there was something that needed some real Armstrong kind of editing. So I'm very grateful that I had the good fortune of 2 wonderful editors. Now, Julie, by now you've forgotten what Julie asked me to read about. So briefly, I'll tell you again the background to this story that I'm going to read an excerpt from is that there is a friend and colleague of mine. We work together in the same office and we have become friends. I have just graduated from college and taken this job in Victoria. He is not only a friend, but he's a real mentor. He shows me everything, and not only at work, but is very supportive in life. And he was the one who taught me fishing, and, you know, like a big brother. And his name is Doug. And Doug's wife has been diagnosed with stomach cancer. Now, I want to remind you, whether you've read this book or not read this book, I want to remind you that this is a long, long time ago. This was not last month. And this was at a time when there was, well, to be clear, it was in the early 70s, I think around 72. And this was a time when there was no palliative care. This was a time when people dying of cancer and other painful conditions, even in the hospital, were given minimal amounts of pain medication. And so this was quite a different world than we live in today. 2 weeks after I last saw Doug, he contacted me and asked me to come over to their house. He said their friends had started to avoid them, and Janice missed seeing friendly faces. I smiled and said, sure, I'll come over. What time? But the truth was, I didn't want to. I did feel touched and honored that they had thought of me, but this was too big. How could I give comfort or reassurance? Should I bring flowers? When I knocked on their door the next Saturday, I was shaking inside. I smiled and pretended to be confident and happy, but when I saw Janice lying on the sofa, my breath caught for a moment. She had become gray and bony. Her cheeks were wrinkled and gaunt. She spit into a cup. I smiled and said, hi, Janice, but I was fake. What I wanted to say, honestly, was, I'm sorry you're sick. I hate to see you like this. What did the doctors say? Will you recover? Are you going to die? I heard the kids eating lunch with Doug's mother in the kitchen. I was glad Doug was here with us. He continued his story for Janice about what the kids wore and what they talked about as he drove them to preschool yesterday. What was it like for her to know that children's lives had become separate from hers? I couldn't imagine. Doug told her what he'd done at work that day, and a friend had called to say she was planning to come over for a short visit. Anything you want before she comes? He asked. No, she'll just see me as I am. Then she turned to me and asked, how are you? Everything okay? I froze. What could I say? I wanted to tell her it doesn't matter how I am. Compared to you, it's trivial and it doesn't matter. Maybe my visit was like a taste of fresh water for her. Maybe she just wanted to chat about the small and ordinary things. I pushed myself to smile. "Oh, I'm okay," I said. She looked at me with such deep shadows around her eyes, I couldn't go on. But she smiled anyway, and it was painful to know that she had thought about me when everything should be about her. I said, "I do have some news for you. My parents bought 2 acres up on Denman Island. They've wanted to move up there for a long time." To my relief, a look of pleasure spread across her face, and she clapped her bony hands. "Oh, yes," she said, "I'm so happy for them. Your mom told me so many times how she missed living in the country. I'm so glad for them." She turned to Doug. "Isn't that wonderful, honey?" He forced a smile. "Yeah, it's great news. Give them our best wishes," she said. "Yep, give your mom and dad our greetings and best wishes. I haven't seen them for a long time, maybe a few months." "Yeah, it's been a long time," Janice said. "And do give them our best. This is how you get stuck in a moment when everything is compressed. It jolts through you like lightning, makes you want to spit. How can I take wishes from you when I can't give you the same back? Sincerely best wishes. I mean, when there's no hope." This was what I felt so much. It burned inside me, but I didn't have the words. Instead, I just said, "Okay, sure will." Several weeks went by when I saw Doug intermittently and occasionally went over to the house very briefly and very awkwardly like this. And after several more weeks had gone by, we resumed I'm jumping ahead in the story now. Saturday morning, Doug called me at home. "Hey, you okay?" "Yeah." I waited and tried to ignore my tight stomach. "Janice asked me about you. You should go see her in the hospital. It would cheer her up." I froze inside. "You sure? Why, is she feeling better?" "Not really. She still can't eat anything." "Oh, still? Shouldn't I wait until she feels better?" "No, now is better." "Oh, she's so sick. I thought she'd be too miserable to have visitors." "Yeah, well, she is miserable. That's why she needs visitors. She's isolated there. She hasn't seen the kids since last Sunday. She feels like the world forgot her." "You think I should go?" "Yeah, well, she said it would make her feel better." There was another pause, like he was waiting for me to say something. "I don't know how much longer she can hang on." "Yeah, it must be hard," I said. I thought he meant she was impatient, but then I had an awful feeling that he meant something else. "Okay, I'll go see her this afternoon." "Thanks." "You'll be there?" I asked. "I'm not sure. I promised the kids I'd spend time with them this afternoon, so it depends on when we finish." I couldn't say no, but I hated watching her pain and her gradual starvation while she burped her stomach into a cup. I was a cowardly friend. That afternoon, I parked the car in front of the hospital and stared at the dashboard to get myself ready. I took some deep breaths and made up my mind to look at Janice and listen to her 100%, no matter how difficult. The hospital corridors smelled like poison soap. She was curled sideways in bed, her face twisted into a grimace, both hands pressed to her stomach. I forced myself to whisper, "You in pain?" She nodded and bit her lip. I sat down and put a hand on her arm. Her dark eyes looked at me as if she'd never see me again. She whispered, "It's okay. It comes and goes. It comes and goes in waves." She closed her eyes and I watched her breaths gradually slow down. Then she opened her eyes again and looked at me with such a thin smile, it broke my heart. "Hey," she said, "hey, thanks for coming. You look better than 2 weeks ago when I was at your place." "Really?" "Yeah, I wished I could take my words back and start again. I should have said, to tell the truth, you look awful. I'm so sorry." There are moments like the click of a camera when both you and the other person recognize something and you capture it, but you just don't say it. Janice blinked and said, "Oh, that's so kind of you." And she tried to smile again. I hated myself for being so stupid because she was the one who rescued me, even at this moment when the true thought in my mind was, "I can't imagine you'll live another day." Her skin was mottled white and gray, dark under her eyes. She had become a skeleton with a smell from another world. There was an IV taped to one skinny arm, like something stuck into the branch of a tree. "Well, hopefully you'll get out of here soon. The next time I come to see you, you'll be at home." "I don't think so," she said. "Did they give you something for pain?" "Not much. The doctor said he didn't want to give me too much morphine." "Oh, I see. But I didn't. The least I could do was just be there with her without pretending. So I sat in silence. And we looked at each other. After a minute, she reached a hand toward me. Her cool fingers curled around mine. She smiled and said, "Thanks for coming to see me." "Sure, I'm glad to see you. See you again soon." As I left the hospital, I wondered, why is it so hard to tell the truth when it's that close to you? Is there any truth? Is there any truth that isn't potentially painful or messy? These questions sat inside me like lumps of mud. As my mother said to me hundreds of times when I was a child, if you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything. Well, here I was now faced only with truths that weren't nice. And to not say what should be said has its own risks. Lies of omission. Some truth dies because nobody cares for it. Those were the risks of not unpacking my bag.
Thank you so much, Samuel. That's an amazing passage. It strikes me how one of the repeating themes through your book is that towards death, there's such a strong, intense need for human connection and an opportunity for really intimate connection too. And yet it's so difficult. And in a sense, the whole book is about attempts, sometimes successful, sometimes not, to make those kinds of connections close to death. And one of the things that comes up repeatedly in your book is your observations about the relief that patients have felt when someone breaks into the truth and is able to acknowledge the truth and to talk frankly and openly about what is happening, what's actually happening. Why do you think that that relief is so strong and so powerful? And why do you think it's so that we find it so hard to do? Why do we avoid doing it so much?
The question of the age. A question we all struggle with. We all, including me, we all struggle with lies of omission, lies of commission. That is to say, what we don't say that we should and what we do say that we shouldn't say because it's not true. And we struggle with those, as you pointed out, Julie. They can, those ways of avoiding the truth can become our technique for avoiding the truth. And as you ask why, how did we decide at some point to avoid the truth? It's clear, I think clear to all of us when we watch children freely at play, how much more easily truth comes to them. Sometimes so easily that they say or do things that hurt the feelings of their playmates.
And then they get shushed. They
That's
make
right.
observations that are honest, and we say, "Oh, shh, don't point
right.
that out." Yeah.
That's right. Or God forbid that one of our children or grandchildren might say something to us at a moment of anger or in a very innocent manner that makes us for that moment feel misunderstood or disrespected or whatever our stuff that might be triggered by a child speaking. It's another shush. Don't say that. Traditionally, of course, I think most people are aware of this, that traditionally, boys especially, but girls often too, are told at a very early age, stop crying.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the, I'm convinced, it's one of the major exercises of human life that teach us at a very early age, don't experience your emotions.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, because to me, in a way, the whole book reads as one person's journey to unlocking emotion and resisting the impulse to push those emotions down, beginning in childhood and all the way through. So I think it's so powerful how you tell us all of these stories of observing and being with people in their moments of suffering and death. And then towards the end of the book, you discuss your own diagnosis and illness, and are very open about the fact that despite the fact that you've had all this practice as a physician, helping other people through it, when the moment comes, there's still that impulse that you had to fight of pushing things down and distance, creating a distance from those emotions. So it's a lifelong journey, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
lifelong practice.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the word practice comes up, I think, in the book in very meaningful ways. I
Yeah.
love the passages of you as a child observing animals and death and just what's happening around in nature. There's such a purity of child's consciousness. And I have the impression of a child who's just trying to figure out how this death thing works and is getting no guidance whatsoever from the adults. If anything, is kind of being ripped away from the experience, distanced from the experience, just when that little boy is immersing himself in the experience and trying to understand it. And if you put yourself back in the mind of that little child, do you have a sense of what kind of guidance from adults might have been helpful to you at that age, or might be helpful to children generally?
To help me and you and anybody listening, let's see if we can imagine the year 1945.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps the closest we can come to imagining that is if anybody has looked on YouTube at some old World War II movies, especially if there's anything that shows, rather than the war in Europe and war in Pacific, if it shows what the ordinary people were going through back home in North America, in Canada and US, what life was like. By then I was 3 years old and living in the area I described in far southern Alberta, very remote area. surrounded by forests, wild animals. And so it was by nature, or by default, it was a rough life in some ways. I mean, it was really, there was one foot in the pioneer world for people who've read about our immigrant and pioneer ancestors. It really had that. We had no outside electricity and no indoor plumbing, and the house we lived in, which was beautiful, was made of log and heated entirely by a wood stove, and it had the luxury of a wood burning furnace under the floor. I'm sure it was a real fire trap, but we were able to have a pretty snug, comfortable existence in our way, which today would seem awfully rustic and deprived, but for us was just wonderful. So for a period of time, actually those first 4 years of my life, I was the youngest of 4 kids. And around the age of 4, a younger brother was born. So for a while, I was the youngest of 4 kids, and then my mother getting pregnant, and she was at home while my dad was away. She was taking care of the household, baking and cooking, and under challenging conditions. And so she was only too happy if I wasn't demanding of her time.
Mm-hmm.
And
you were left to figure the world out on your own.
Yes, I was. And so from one perspective, one could say that I could have really benefited from some discussion from my parents mm-hmm. about all kinds of stuff, certainly including death. But a key thing as I look back is I never asked them. Mm-hmm. I don't recall asking a single question about, remember the chicken that you killed last week? What happened? Is there a chicken heaven?
So do you think that's because you absorbed at such a young age that this was a topic to avoid?
I do. Oh, no. Sorry, I misunderstood your question and answered too quickly. I think it was the experience of animals at first was so, it wasn't daily by any means, but the experience of dead trees, branches, leaves, flowers, worms, bugs, the most common living beings that I was surrounded by, it was clear they were recycling themselves constantly. And after a while, it was pretty easy to figure out the life cycle by looking up, seeing trees standing, some that were half down, some cracked over, some covered with moss, some barely recognizable anymore as trees, but still recognizable. And then I began to notice the same thing with skeletons in the forest. Skeletons of horses or partial skeletons were very dramatic. And I did ask some of my older siblings about the bones and what were they, and they explained this is a horse's skull and so on. But I didn't have questions about is there a horse heaven or what happens to us as we die. I think because it just it was such a integral part of my daily life that question hadn't surfaced yet as something important. Actually, it was a much more salient question was one that I asked my mother several times, which is to explain what thunder was. And thunder was a much more pressing.
It's interesting as you're talking, I'm reminded of something that Hannah Arendt wrote. She wrote that humans are the only mortal species. And what she meant by that is that humans are the only species that see themselves as apart from the cycles of the universe. Nature goes in a cyclical manner, but humans see life in terms of their own life, which has a beginning and an end. So there's no going back. You only go forward in time, and when it's over, because we think of life as our own individual lives, as something
Yes.
separate from the universe.
Yes.
And what you're describing is a child who's really in tune with that cyclical aspect of life and death. And presumably we all learn at some point that what matters is our own individual life that's separate from that, and that's running on its linear course, and that
Yes.
there's a tragedy of death at the end of it. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. I was so close to horses. They were like siblings to me. I was physically close, emotionally close, and it was repeatedly being exposed or literally bumping into dead horses or horse skeletons, that it began to get through to me that the same might be true of people.
Right.
Although I think it was not until I was around 4 years old that that it really caught my attention or made me curious enough to wonder, well, yeah, what about people?
And what about me?
What about me, finally?
Yeah, exactly. Could I ask you about the phrase that is a fairly recent phrase, the phrase toxic positivity, which is the phrase that people use in a situation where someone is facing a tragedy or great suffering, and people around them are reluctant to acknowledge it and kind of insist on turning towards only the positive and not acknowledging the pain. Does this phrase resonate for you? What do you think can be, I mean, on the face of it, positivity seems so nice. What is toxic about it? And how do you avoid the toxicity of it while maintaining the good aspects of positivity?
Oh, yeah, great question. I suppose from the broadest perspective that comes to my mind, any point of view that is inflexible inevitably becomes toxic, doesn't it? So we've probably all of us known somebody who was a toxic grouch because they could never stop being a grouch.
Right.
And toxic, looking on the dark side, so to speak, to such an extent that it feels toxic. You don't like being around that person because all that person can do is grumble. And so I think it's just the flip side. And you're right. I have known a few people who were just so firmly, desperately clinging to a smile on the face from morning until night, no matter what, as well as let's look on the bright side of things. That's what my ancestors used to say.
Yeah.
As somebody was run over by a wagon or trampled to death, well, let's look on the bright side.
Right. Yeah, maybe tomorrow, but today.
Right.
Yeah, no, that notion of flexibility really resonates, because I think one of the things that really comes through in your book is the power of being present with people where they're at and just tuning into what they happen to need, what their own history is, what their own baggage is, and paying attention to that, being attentive to that. So that really, really resonates. I'm wondering, have you encountered in your many years people for whom denial actually was an effective coping strategy? That they kind of refused to look death in the face and that worked for them?
All of us.
Well, okay.
All of us need a rest once in a while.
True enough.
Yeah, and the cultures, well, I don't pretend to be an expert on cultures. So rather than saying the cultures, as if I was a widely read anthropologist, I'll restart and I'll say, I'm aware of some cultures that really strongly promote our exercising an awareness of death and an acceptance of the fact that death is always present and it's inevitably present. It's an inevitable part of our lives, and we do well. It's beneficial for us to think of that and ponder that frequently. The Tibetan Buddhist teachings, I think, are by far the best known examples of that meditation on death. And as that cultural practice was thankfully translated for North American culture, and it transformed to a more North American way of looking at those practices, it became clear, I think, to everybody who studies that an awareness of death makes us much more aware of life. And an appreciation of death makes us appreciate life. And so thankfully, there's a really nice feedback loop for people who spend a moderate amount of time either meditating or sharing with a loved one important issues or thoughts or feelings about death, or perhaps with a counselor or whatever is helpful.
Yeah.
But, almost inevitably, life seems more precious and brighter.
I want to get to your second selection in a minute, and then I want to make sure that we also leave time for questions and answers from the audience. But I wanted to ask you whether your experience of your own illness has given you, I mean, you've come to this point after a long career of seeing many people suffer and die and struggle. And I want to say also that there is a lot of death in this book, but just to keep things suspenseful, not everyone dies in all of the chapters. So there is that little edge of suspense going on as well. But after all of this body of experience, have you found that there were some experiences that came from your own illness that gave you a somewhat different slant, or that made you think that there were things that you would have done slightly differently had you had those insights earlier in your career? Is there anything you learned about what patients might need, for example, in certain situations?
I think by the time I was diagnosed, for the sake of those who haven't read the book, I'll just add, by the time I was diagnosed 2.5 years ago with stage 4 lung cancer, so that's the illness that Julie is referring to. By that time, there was always something new that I was learning as I talked with people about, in regard to their thoughts and feelings about death. And I've asked myself the same question you have since the diagnosis, and my experience with physicians and everything that's happened. I've asked myself the same. Have I learned something new? And that was particularly true finishing up this book, asking myself, do I see things differently? And I was surprised, actually, in some ways, not really. And it may be somewhat related to my age, I should say the number of years that I have been doing this work, which is now, it's more than 40 years, that I don't know, I think the volume is less than somebody who is working full-time for hospice, but the number of years working in this field has been so long that I've had ample opportunities to trip all over myself and to recognize, which I do, that if I were to meet somebody tomorrow and they said that I want to talk with you about death, that inevitably somewhere along the way I would be thoughtless or forgetful or not very mindful. You know, it just I've come to the conclusion that's part of who I am. And the question is, am I paying attention enough that I can notice that? I feel extraordinarily lucky and blessed, actually, that the physicians I have been such good listeners. Who would have ever thought?
Yeah, that is wonderful to hear. In my experience, I've seen both.
Yes, me too. And I've been
It's
both.
very powerful when they're capable of listening.
Yes.
So I wonder if we can, we're getting close to the time when I would love to take some of the questions that are beginning to pop up, but I want to make sure that we have time to have you read that second selection, which I think is just a remarkable moment of connection with a small boy who is close to death. Would you be willing to read that before we open up the Q&A?
Yes, and this won't be a surprise to Julie because I've already asked her this, but for the sake of those listening in or viewers, I just want to let you know that this evening, my voice is actually much better than it usually is. Ordinarily, I would be able to get only about halfway through reading something and then ask Julie to take it over for there. And I have a feeling that may be the case this time, that I'll probably get into it for a few minutes and then probably ask Julie to finish reading. And
Okay.
just wanted you to know why. It's to save my voice for the last half hour or last 5 hours or however long we're going to be here.
Okay.
So Julie gave you a little background. This is a 7-year-old boy who is dying of cancer. And again, this is a long time ago. And yet the issues are not that different. For him, surprisingly, pain is not a major issue. As you're going to see, it turns out there's a different issue. Now, I was not providing palliative care in a formal sense because there was no palliative care in those days. This was in the late 70s, early 80s, and palliative care had not yet been organized. But because of the nature of the clinical work I was doing with patients, I was often asked, because my colleagues knew I had experience talking with patients who had some difficulty expressing themselves. They asked if I would come and meet this child whose major problem was he had stopped talking to everybody, including his parents. He had turned over towards the wall in his hospital room and refused to respond to his mother and father, as well as to nurses and physicians. And there was a lot of concern whether he was even drinking any water, which, it was clear that he was probably going to die within the next 4 or 5 days, week maximum. But if he wanted water, people wanted him to sip it for comfort. And so it was exceptionally distressing to everybody concerned. Imagine how his parents felt, not even being able to communicate with him. So I came into his room together with Dr. Navarro, who I'll refer to. Dr. Navarro is a psychiatry member of the faculty in the medical school from psychiatry, and he and I are good friends, good colleagues. And we come into the room and the parents stand, and I ask them if they would like to take a short break, drive home take a shower, change clothes, come back, because I said to them, I'll probably want to stay here for quite a while. And they did. They were glad for that welcome. They've left. Dr. Navarro has a seat in the corner, and I'm standing there in the middle of the room watching Danny, this boy, whose face is toward the wall. It struck me suddenly in that moment of silence that Danny seemed far away to everyone else, but to me, he was close. A surprise. We were on the same remote island. He didn't intend to separate himself from others, just as I didn't. Both of us wanted the opposite. There must be a language that connected here to there, this world to that island. But what was it? It was like that for me when I arrived home every evening. Michael and Athena, my son and daughter, they asked me, what did you do at work today? Tell us what happened today. I wished I could. I knew their questions weren't intended to intrude on my private world. They just wanted to connect. But I couldn't tell the story, not even to myself. Intrusion versus connection. They wanted the right words, and so did I. That was how I knew where Danny was, but I couldn't explain it. There were no words. I watched his back and shoulders rise and fall, one breath at a time. My throat and chest were tight too, because we breathed the same air. I leaned forward and touched his back. I wanted my hand to say, I understand you, whether we speak or not. But at least I warmed him a little because my hand was warmer than his body. After some time, a nursery tune came to me, so I hummed it. Rock-a-bye, don't you cry, we will go to Grammy's. He took a deep breath and half turned to look over one shoulder at me. Then he rolled onto his back and looked directly into my eyes. His face was gaunt, with eyes that had been staring into another world. What's that song? He asked. A lullaby. I sing it to my children at night to help them sleep. I waited. After a few minutes, I asked, what do you need to help you sleep? I'm worried about mommy and papi. What do you worry about? They're so sad. They're sad that I'm going to die. How do you know? Because I hear them crying. Sometimes Papi turns his face away or goes out of the room. And mommy, when she starts to cry, she changes the subject or tries to joke about something else. That's even worse. I see. What do you think is the reason? It's because they're so sad and worried about me. I sat, leaned forward, and touched his bony arm through the covers. What about you? Are you worried about you? No, I don't think so. They said when my grandma died, she went to be with Jesus and the angels. That's where I'm going too. Is that a happy place? Yes, I'll be okay, but I'll miss them a lot. Sure, I understand. I don't know if I'll see them again. His eyes were so solemn and sad. I felt my heart pound because he had opened his own heart to such a terrible truth. I was afraid to say more, but there was no turning back. Do you think it's possible to see them again? I think so, if they come to visit me. Did you ever visit anybody in a cemetery? Yes, like when we went to the cemetery with flowers for grandma and grandpa, and we told them stories. I know they heard us talk to them and sing them songs. Did they talk to you? I couldn't hear them, but I could feel them. He smiled just for a second, and we took food to them. I always liked going there, especially on Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. Especially on Dia de los Muertos. Do you know what that is? I nodded. We just passed that a few weeks ago, didn't we? Oh, we did? Yes. I didn't know that. They didn't tell me. Would it help if your mom and dad came to visit you after you die? I asked. Yes, I think so, he frowned. But do I have to wait until next year for Dia de los Muertos? I wish they could come every week. You can ask them. Every time we took flowers and ate a picnic, and my mom told stories, and we played all around the places where people are buried. The graves, yes. And the stones. We put little stones on their grave. We made designs and pictures. That's what I want them to do after I die, so I won't be lonely. And then I'll know they're okay. Anybody besides your mom and dad? Just my mom and dad and my little sister. Would it be okay for them to know everything you told me? Okay. Somehow his hand had come out from under the covers and found mine. His eyes closed. Now I'm going to sleep. Can you come back and talk with me again? Sure, I will. We're going to stay here with you until your parents come back this afternoon, and Dr. Navarro will help them a lot. Okay, Julie, I'm gonna need you to step in and give my throat a break.
Okay,
Got a flat tire.
happy to. I felt his hand become soft as his breaths deepened. Dr. Navarro and I sat without a word as the room darkened in the late afternoon. Finally, Danny took a deep breath and rolled on his side toward us. His hand slid from mine. Dr. Navarro and I smiled at each other. I'm not sure what happened, he whispered, but it was some kind of miracle. So complicated, but so easy. I can't explain it, but he found me as much as I found him, I whispered. I really don't know how to explain it, but when I can, I'll tell you. No hurry. Miracles don't need explanation. All I can say right now is I've never had cancer, but I recognize the island he was stuck on. Yeah? Yeah. I don't need a map or a passport. You speak the language. Yes. When Dr. Navarro and I returned the next morning, Danny lay on his back, alone in the room. He looked at us and smiled. Can I ask you a question? Sure. I sat beside him. Dr. Navarro sat in his usual chair in the corner. Can we see after we die? He asked. I felt his question suck the breath from my chest. I thought, how can I answer this? I have nothing left. I want to lie in a bed with a teddy bear and have people bring me something to eat and explain what everything means. It was as if a curtain had been pulled from a window where there was too much to see at once. How could we possibly talk about it? But then, inexplicably, I took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. And it felt like the sweetest thing I could imagine. Can you see me? I asked. Yes, of course. He grinned like this was a game. I can see you too, very well. We gazed at each other, both smiling the way people do when there's a happy surprise coming. Now, close your eyes for a few seconds, I told him. He closed his eyes. Now, with your eyes closed, can you still see me? He laughed. Yes, I can, but it's different. Not with my eyes. I see you in my mind. He opened his eyes again and stared at me. And I see you too, even when I leave this room. Even when I go home, I can still see you. We see everything with eyes, but we can see with our thoughts too, he said, as he stared at me. I'm going to see you after I die. And I will see you. I think maybe everything can see us in some way. Interesting. Can you say more? Plants and trees. I always thought flowers can see me when I put my nose inside to smell them. At this moment, his parents returned with a bag that held apple juice and snacks. I squeezed Danny's hand in one of the teddy bear's paws. I told the parents, hasta luego, and waved at Dr. Navarro, who stayed to visit. Now they could drink juice and talk about everything.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Samuel. Okay, we have some questions in the chat, and if you have any more that you would like to ask, please pile them in. I'll read the questions out loud, and Samuel, you can take them on if you feel like it. So this one is from Emily. Any comments on the role of humor? I worked as a social worker in hospital emergency for 10 years. Humor was a significant MO during traumatic deaths in emergency. What, in your experience, does the role of humor play when death occurs over a protracted period of time? Excellent question.
From your experience, the Emily, having worked in the emergency department, from your experience, you know that people who work in these highly stressful environments get together on their own at times and just sometimes crack everything open and laugh about some of the most bizarre or difficult parts of it, typically in a way that is respectful, and yet that is also respectful to their own need to just let out this pent up energy that's inside there. If it is held inside too much, then eventually it can become toxic, just like anything that is buried too long under the wrong conditions, doesn't have an opportunity to ventilate and to be composted. Some people, which is what happened to me, some people burn out. And
can you say a bit more about that experience, Samuel?
About being burned out?
Yeah.
I didn't know who to share this with or how. Even if there, actually, I had a couple of very close colleagues I could have, but it didn't occur to me. And certainly I didn't have the understanding very early in my career of how crucial this was. I was very much in the MO of taking care of people. That was who I had become in my earlier years, was a caretaker kind of person. And so it was very easy for me to step into a role like this and to be a super guy who was not very touched. And it was to my great detriment, which is why some of the stories in this book talk about my own struggle and my own nightmares at times, trying to figure out what to do with all of this distress. Now, luckily, as more years have gone by, it's if anybody knows anything about recycling, you know, it means you turn over and you turn over and you invite new in, and you that's true in composting in the garden. It's true with the emotions we have. Now, yeah. Humor in regard to the actual scene of somebody dying is something that I agree with Emily can be really powerful. And it is not at all unusual in the midst of great sadness, of great tragedy. It's not unusual for people to suddenly remember something that's humorous. Julie and I were talking about the custom of wakes or various kinds of memorials or funerals, or in some families, in some cultures, where singing and laughter and telling risque jokes about the departed, telling all kinds of secrets that make everybody break up in laughter. That's considered to be an important part of the grieving for many people. So,
yeah, it's almost like there's a mixing of emotion that happens, and
yeah,
what's powerful is that you allow that mixing of laughter
yeah,
and love and grief and sadness all at once.
that was the case when both of my parents died separately, and our family and friends got together, and 20 or 30-ish kind of people. And at times there was this group of people, half of them laughing, half of them crying, and all mixing together. And I think that role for humor, when it's invited by the people who are grieving, not invited by the caretakers or the guides that they've invited to be there.
Yeah, so the key again is that attentiveness.
Yes, right.
There's another question here. How do you teach people, Susan asks, how do you teach people who think that sympathy is the same as empathy? They just do not understand what empathy is. Is this a question that you relate to, that distinction that you also make between sympathy and empathy?
No, I don't. I don't make it because it can just be well, choose your metaphor. It can be a rabbit hole, or it can be a tar baby, or it can be a sticky wicket. What I mean is, it's definitions, and I have very, very little to teach people, to teach anyone. There's precious little that I know when it comes to definitions. Experience, I think, is what we all crave. We all certainly, those of us who want to be of help to other people, it is certainly helpful to understand, I guess, from one might say, a theoretical point of view. So I don't mean to be cavalier and dismiss the distinction between empathy and sympathy, but the reason I'm not diving into it and defining it myself is because there's plenty that's been written, and anyone who's curious can read up on that and make up their own mind and find out, how does that fit for me? And what I want to emphasize more than anything to anybody who asks, how could I be more helpful to my sister or her family, or how could I be more helpful to this patient? I'd rather start with experience rather than talking about definitions of terms, where does that keep us? It keeps us up here, kind of plotting the next move. It's sort of like a chess game. And I'd rather just slide the chess game off to one side and put my hands on the table and look at the other person. And so how are we doing?
One of the things I really appreciate about the book is the theme of struggling for words. It's a constant struggle for words. Yes. And you never offer a magic formula of, what you should say to a dying person. Here we go. Here are some handy phrases. And you really shy away from that, because I think that your message is that it's not so much about the words, it's about the presence with that person.
Yeah,
that's exactly what matters. And I wonder if that's maybe what Susan had in mind when she was referring to empathy, is the importance of that presence as being so valuable.
Yes.
Janine asks a really, really important question, I think. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. How do you balance validating people's feelings of fear or anger or grief while also encouraging hope? Is it possible to do both at once?
I think all of us do that with each other, perhaps without realizing it. If when you are listening to a friend or a loved one, a colleague who is struggling with with these kind of issues that we're talking about. I think it can be helpful first and foremost to just do a little checklist and to ask oneself, am I already working, as I'm listening, am I already working on a reply? And if I'm already working on a reply as I'm listening, then chances are I'm not going to be as helpful as they need. Whereas if I'm simply purely listening with all of my attention dedicated towards understanding as clearly as I can, and if anything, any question I might have would simply be, can you say more, or can you help me understand more, or can you clarify what you meant by, just so I can understand more. I think that's the entry point that all of us hope for with a loved one or somebody we want to be helpful to, which is to be there without as you said, Julie, to be present with a connection and without any particular strategy that needs to be employed.
So the answer is, if you listen hard enough, you will know if it's a time to validate the anger or if it's a time to offer hope. And there isn't any magic mix that we can kind of pull out of our bags that will do the
fact, what is more validating than listening without a reply? I think everybody who is viewing this video is doing so because of an innate curiosity and need about this topic. And I trust that everybody, each individual listening to this, has that inner strength and capacity to listen and take it in. And that's already such a validating position to be in, whether the person is ranting and cussing the physician, or cussing the fact that the slings and arrows of life have brought me to this and my house has been burnt down, whatever it may be. That's, everybody here is bringing a validating spirit just by the fact of their presence.
A question here from Rona. Any comments on the hospice movement? I have a guess what you might say about this. It was a godsend to my sister-in-law. She died recently, and also to the family. She and we had so much emotional freedom. Also, thank you, a moving presentation. So what are your thoughts on the hospice movement?
I'm a big fan. Hospice and palliative care are provided by people, and we are flawed. And so it's important, as a disclaimer, I think, for all of us to recognize that hospice as a service is potentially a marvelous service, and palliative care. It's worthwhile spending a little time sorting out the difference between hospice and palliative care, because they're not exactly the same. They overlap, but they are somewhat separate in important ways. And they're a wonderful service. And by far, the majority of people who go into both of those fields, hospice and palliative care, are just enormously wonderful, lovable, loving, highly skilled people. I have encountered experiences with hospice that were so terrible they made my hair stand up. And I don't mean terrible with the patients, I mean with my colleagues that I thought were terrible. But that's no different than other aspects of caring for people. When those things happened, I would always groan and sigh and say, well, I know I've made other people's hair stand up more than once too. So, it's like everything else. As a patient, uh, ironic to say, but at this point in time, I'm not debilitated enough that I would qualify to be taken care of by hospice. Although I do have a palliative care doctor who helps me a lot through Stanford. So anyway, they just at the best, they offer what they have to offer, and we would do well for ourselves to take advantage of that, and it can be of great benefit.
One last question, and then I think it's going to be time to wrap up. So there's a question here on any comments on coping with uncertainty for individual and for family members and relationship between all. Uncertainty is the great difficulty.
Yeah, there's kind of a philosophic cosmic comment that's not particularly helpful in a practical way, but it's worth commenting on, which is, what is life if not uncertain? That's worthwhile now and then reminding ourselves about. At least I remind myself about that. But I think a much more practical and individually meaningful way of thinking about uncertainty is to recognize that it's, at least from my perspective, uncertainty is based on a foundation of fear about what I might lose, or what I'm certain to lose, or what I'm about an impending loss of myself, of my own life, of my own being, or of somebody else. So it's this anticipation of pain, grief, and really that stance turns its back on what actually exists. It's as if I've got a long stick and I'm pushing on the curtain this way and that way, trying to figure out what's behind the curtain without having a clue what there is right here beside me and behind me. I turn around and I look behind me, and what do I see? The sunshine outside. I see a loved one smiling at me. I see somebody sitting with me quietly with such a calm, loving expression on their face. And that reminds me, that's what our whole life is about, is this sharing with each other these little moments that we cherish. It's seldom the big fireworks. It's more the moments that we spent coloring in the coloring book with our kids or our grandkids, or that we spent with a loved one as we were just watching the birds in the trees.
So pulling your attention into the present rather than casting it into the unknown future. That certainly resonates with difficult times in my life, and the power of those moments, those individual moments in the midst of who knows what is coming. Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's the end of our questions. I just want to share a couple of comments here that have come in. I'm not sure that I'm going to get to all of them. Janine commented, such a beautiful and simple answer to my question, the one about how to balance validation of difficult emotions with hope.
Thank you.
And Esmeralda wrote, I need to go, but thank you for today. This is an important and necessary book we'll definitely read. And Sharon wrote, thank you for this gift. I look forward to reading it. In my experience, humor is key to opening and giving permission to close ones. My issue was and is with my family seeming to me to be waiting to say something real is to wait for the end. Like a movie, like everyone thinks it's not time yet. It's not, we're not there yet. Maybe because none of us know when that will be, even with a terminal illness involved. So many factors to consider. It seems your writing examines this very issue. indeed, and many others. So I really cannot recommend this book more highly. I think everybody needs to read it because everyone has will have these experiences, whether we want to or not, as you drive home. So thank you so much, Samuel, for writing this book and for joining us today and being with us. This was really wonderful to have this time together. And June, I think that is probably the end of our session. Do we want to stop the recording? And I don't know if Samuel wants to hang on and just wave to people.
Sure.
If people want to maybe just stay on for another 5 minutes to say hello, or we could stop the official recording at this point.
Okay. Well,
Okay.